That's what caused the problem. But because of the way that we produce food today, where we collect from many, many different farms and pool them together before distribution, you get a lot of cross-contamination. That's what happened. We saw this last month as well in Europe, and there's still 900 people who are on dialysis because they ate the wrong kind of food. It happens to be sprouts, and the sprouts were again contaminated by bacteria. That too came from an organic source. So the recall that was initiated was because the food supply had been contaminated. So we hear all of these things, and it's hard to know what to make of it. It's enough to drive you to drink, right? Which is okay, as long as you drink red wine. Because we've heard all about those kind of benefits, right? How a chemical in red wine called resveratrol reduces the risk of heart disease, how it's an antioxidant and all of that. So we start drinking that glass of red wine, but then we find out that we have to be careful there too, because alcohol, in fact, is a carcinogen. It is. If alcohol were a synthetic substance that some marketer wanted to introduce into our food supply, it would never be allowed. They would have to approach Health Canada or FDA in the US saying that they have some new food component. Alcohol would never be allowed because it is such a well-established cancer-causing agent. It predisposes to breast cancer, it predisposes to oral cancers. However, it is not a synthetic substance, it's a naturally occurring fermentation product. It is not governed by any of our food laws. So it's quite okay to sell natural carcinogens, but the synthetic ones are the ones that need to be controlled. Of course, your body does not care about the origin of a compound, whether it comes from nature or made in a lab. The only thing your body cares about is what it is, what its molecular structure is, and how it can be handled. So we don't want to overdo alcoholic beverages. We want to limit it. Once again, it is the dose that makes the poison. Numbers are important. Amounts are important. But we've got to drink something, right? So what are we going to drink? Can't be alcohol. Back we go to the tap water. Well, tap water is chlorinated. The chlorination of tap water, probably the single biggest scientific breakthrough in the history of the world. I don't think that there's anything else that has saved as many lives as the chlorination of drinking water. Millions and millions and millions of people are alive because we have chlorinated water. Unfortunately, many people in the world don't have access to this. And a pure water supply is something that we need to achieve in the developing world. But in any case, since the water is chlorinated, there are some compounds that form as a result of that chlorination. They're called trihalomethanes. They are carcinogens. A definition of a carcinogen is a substance that in any dose causes any kind of cancer in a test animal. The carcinogen does not imply that it's a human carcinogen. It just means it's a substance that is capable of causing some cancer in some animal at some dose. Well, that is the case for these trihalomethanes, things like chloroform. You give it in large dose to a rat, you will trigger cancer. That doesn't mean it happens in humans. Now, there is some evidence that even at the small doses to which we are exposed, there is a small risk. Estimates are that about 20,000 people in the world every year develop bladder cancer because they drink chlorinated water. Now, that's not an insult, but you have to weigh this against the benefit. You have to weigh it against how many lives are being saved by chlorination. Everything comes down to a risk-benefit analysis. And of course, if we could do away with trihalomethanes, so much the better. Technology is available to do that. There are filters that will remove the trihalomethanes from the water. Even a simple filter that you use at home, that you screw onto your tap, or the Brita type of filter, that will remove these things. So anyway, but people hear these stories and they panic, say, all right, we don't want to drink the tap water. Give us bottled water that's pure. Well, indeed, the bottled water that you buy in these large jugs may come from some natural spring, which doesn't require chlorination because there's no contamination with bacteria. That's true. But then you find out that the bottle that is used is made of polycarbonate, which leaches bisphenol A into the water. And that's a chemical that's been in the news a great deal because it's referred to as an endocrine disruptor. And some research suggests that this may be one of the reasons that we are seeing premature puberty in girls. As you know, the age of menarche today is 11, 12. That's when girls are reaching maturity. It used to be 17, 18, 100 years ago. Well, that's not evolution. That's something environmental. What is it? Probably better nutrition. Better nutrition during pregnancy and during childhood. That's probably the answer. But it's also possible that there's a component of environmental chemicals that we have released. Since the Second World War, we have released some 80,000 compounds into the environment. We don't know the effects of all of these. When you're talking about hormones, even small amounts can have an effect. So an environmental contaminant that has a hormone-like property may become a concern. And bisphenol A is in fact an issue. So people say, all right, well, I don't want that. I'm not going to be drinking any water from these jugs that are made of polycarbonate. Let me drink water from these disposable bottles, which are made of polyester. That has nothing to do with bisphenol A. There's no question of bisphenol A being present in there, so you're happily drinking from there. Until you find out that that polyester is actually made with a catalyst called antimony trioxide. And antimony, for those of you who remember, if you look at your periodic table, is in the same chemical family as arsenic. And that's not very comforting because arsenic is highly toxic. And indeed, there are remnants of antimony that leach out from that plastic into the water. You're getting some antimony trioxide. So you want to say, no, I can't have that either. And by this time, I mean, you're really becoming concerned. You begin to sweat. But you can't sweat too much because then you have to use an antiperspirant. And you find out that antiperspirants are preserved with chemicals called parabens. And you can dig through the scientific literature, and some researchers will suggest that that parabens is linked to breast cancer. Well, this is a study that is out there. It is constantly referred to on the web about deodorants, antiperspirants being linked to breast cancer. It was a study that was so poorly done that it wouldn't even pass a high school science fair project. But nevertheless, once something is out there, you can't get it back. In this particular case, the researcher took samples of breast tumors from about 20 patients and found parabens and concluded that therefore this was a cause of breast cancer. She had no controls whatsoever, never tested any healthy women to see if they also had parabens in their tissue, which they do, because parabens is a widely used preservative in cosmetics and food supply, and we all have some of this in our body. But she never had any controls. Furthermore, she just assumed that the parabens that she found in the tumors must have come from antiperspirants because they're close to the breast when you use them. Antiperspirants are not preserved with parabens. So this was completely nonsensical. And yet, there's widespread belief out there that antiperspirants are a cause of breast cancer. So people worry about all kinds of things. So if you can't use an antiperspirant in order to make yourself presentable to your fellow man or woman, at least you can take a shower, right? To wash off all of those natural fragrances. What could possibly be wrong with taking a shower? Well, turns out plenty. Last year, studies showed that there are 108 different chemicals that are released from a shower curtain when you're taking a shower. Someone actually went to the trouble of taking an air sample during the shower, analyzing this, and finding 108 chemicals. It isn't really surprising because these days with our analytical chemistry we can find things down to parts per trillion. You know, that's a second in 32,000 years. We can find that. Or just because something is there doesn't mean that it's causing a problem. I mean, we live in a chemically very complex world. If you consider your coffee, sniff your coffee, you're sniffing over 1,000 different compounds, all naturally occurring. Some of them are carcinogens. Nobody worries about this because the amounts, of course, are so small. So no, that shower curtain is not lurking in wait to do us in. And yet there were all kinds of articles published last year which insinuated that if you were taking a shower with a polyvinyl chloride shower curtain, you were actually risking your health because you'd be inhaling these 108 chemicals. Of course, it never even showed that those 108 chemicals were being inhaled. They never did any blood tests to show that people were actually being exposed to this. All they did was sample some air in the shower, which really is pretty well meaningless. So you can't even take a shower to make yourself more attractive, but maybe you can paint your fingernails, right? What could be wrong with that? Turns out plenty. Because in order to have the nail polish conform to the shape of the fingernail, you have to plasticize it. You have to soften it. And what they use is a chemical called dibutyl phthalate. Now, here you run into a real concern. Because if you take rodents and you take dibutyl phthalate and you give it to pregnant animals, and then you isolate their male offspring, and you measure the distance between their anus and their genitals, you find that it is unusually short. This, as you might imagine, causes concern in the rodent community. And it does cause concern in the human community as well, because we're exposed to phthalates not only from nail polish, they're found in perfumes, they're found in many, many consumer items. And all of a sudden you start worrying that if you're exposed to these phthalates, you're going to see your orifices merge into one. And nobody looks forward to that. Of course, the doses that were used here were immense compared to what we are exposed to. And this really is no more than a cosmetic problem. I would even suspect that the data is not very reliable, because measurement of the anogenital distance is not such a simple thing. I mean, measure from where to where. So I suspect that there's pretty big built-in error here. So it isn't really a big issue, but again, people get scared by this. So after you hear all of this, say, let me just go back to bed and put a pillow over my head. I don't want to hear any more about these risks in our life. But then it turns out that that pillow is made of polyurethane, and that is releasing chemicals called isocyanates, which are highly toxic. So you clamber out of bed and say, enough of all of this, just, leave me alone. And there's so many worries out there, I don't even know what to worry about next. So you go out and play, but you're playing under electrical lines, and then you remember that someone said that that's associated with leukemia, so you can't have that. So you rush back inside to play, maybe with a balloon, but we have to deflate that as well, because studies have shown that rubber can be contaminated with compounds called nitrosamines, which are known carcinogens. So you can't play with those balloons. You can't play with other rubber items either, because those are also contaminated with nitrosamines the same way. So by this time you say, hell with all of this. The answer is that if you're thirsty, hungry, smelly, unkempt, and bored, that's when you can look forward to a long run, right? Well, the fact is that everything I just told you here is all perfectly true. I mean, it's taken from scientific literature. The fact is that phthalates do have that effect on rodents, etc. But it's all taken out of context. Why? Because I didn't refer to numbers. Science, as you guys well know, is based upon numbers. We're constantly measuring things. Any time that you talk about any sort of risk analysis, you have to bring numbers into play. Let's go back to our polyester bottles for a second. Okay? Indeed, they are made with the catalyst that I told you. You do use antimony trioxide, that's for sure. It is also true that we can measure the amount of antimony in the water, and there is some. It's about 3 parts per billion. That's a very small amount, but we can measure it. I always chide my analytical chemist colleagues that they're really the root of all of our problems, because their techniques now are so good that they're not finding the needle in a haystack, they're finding that needle in a world full of haystacks.